It depends. I think there's something to the story because if you look at different versions, there is definitely a version of it you can find on YouTube where this was like an old VHS tape that someone had recorded it from like the early '80s, and you'll clearly see the Munchkin hanging there. If you watch versions of it now or the Blu-rays, this has all been edited out, or it's a stork there. Sometimes you'll see a stork there instead. But I believe there's something to this.
The Codega is a guide and a storyteller, escorting you through the night, lighting the way, warding off thieves, ghosts, demons, and other oddities. Along the journey, his companions would often share with him the most curious of stories that he'd record in his Codex. Perhaps you just might find yourself traveling with the Codega and sharing one of yours. In the world of classic stories, few have sparked as much curiosity and debate as Alice's Adventure in Wonderland. On the surface, it's a curious tale of a girl tumbling down a rabbit hole into a bizarre, dreamlike world. But beneath the nonsense and riddles, many believe Lewis Carroll embedded layers of symbolism, hidden meanings, and even esoteric knowledge. Some see the Cheshire Cat as a representation of alchemical transformation. Well, others interpret the Mad Hatter's Tea Party as a metaphor for altered states of consciousness. Now, then there's the Jabberwocky, a poem Carroll put into Through the Looking Glass, which to the eye and ear seems like complete nonsense. With words like Brillig, Slithy Toes, and Vorpal Blade, it seems like pure gibberish. But Carroll carefully constructed these words using linguistic techniques, blending existing roots with new sounds to create a sense of meaning that us here and now are just not knowledgeable enough to grasp it. I believe that Jabberwocky actually plays with the idea that language itself shapes reality. If we can assign meaning to nonsense, where does the boundary between real and unreal really lie? Welcome to Codega's Codex of Curiosities. I'm Rye, the Codega, your guide through the hidden corridors of mystery and meaning. Whether it's the shadow corners of history, the strange symbols lurking in plain sight, or the eerie coincidences woven into our most beloved stories, I'm going to be walking ahead with the lantern in hand, illuminating what was never meant to be seen. And tonight, we're stepping into another world of secrets. Maybe we're going to touch on Alice in Wonderland. No, I think we're actually going to do a little bit more of a dive into the Wizard of Oz, which has also been dissected for its hidden messages, strange coincidences, and possible occult connections. And who better to unravel these mysteries than Robert Sullivan IV, a returning guest from episode 26, Truth and Symbolism Hidden in Plain Sight in the Movies. He's an attorney, historian, best-selling author who specializes in decoding the esoteric and symbolic layers hidden in films and books. Tonight, we're diving deep into the Wizard of Oz, beyond the yellow brick road, to explore the strange, the unexplained, and the downright eerie. What secret lies beneath this classic film? And with that, let's jump into it and invite Robert Sullivan to the stage. Robert, welcome to Codega's Codex of Curiosities.
Well, thank you, Rye, for having me on my return appearance. Again, it was wonderful for you to invite me back, and it's my pleasure to be here. So thank you.
Yes, I'm very. I've been looking forward to this. I know the last time we had an interview, you had mentioned you were going to be diving into the Wizard of Oz, and you're like, it's almost a whole episode itself to get into it. And I thought, well, I think I waited enough. It's almost a year, so I'd love to have you back to discuss that and whatever other topics come to mind. So, but before we do that, tell our guests and our listeners, if they haven't found you yet, where to find you, and let them know.
Sure. So again, thanks for having me on. The easiest place to find me on the internet is my website, which is www.robertwsullivan4. That's the number 4.com. There's links there to buy the books, information about me, all my recent podcasts and radio shows. All that will be uploaded to that website, www.robertwsullivan4.com. Again, information about me, appearances, podcasts, links to purchase all my work. Very easy site to navigate, www.robertwsullivan4.com.
Awesome. And it'll also be in the show notes. So for anybody who is looking for that, and you're like, I don't have a pen to write it down. It will be in the show notes. So, the link will be there. Just click on the link and it'll take you to Robert's a website there. So, Robert, the Wizard of Oz, why was that calling to you? Why was that something that you felt drawn to?
Sure. One thing I have to say though before we delve into this is you mentioned Alice in Wonderland, and I can't let you off the hook on that one.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Because that's something I talk about, because the Wizard of Oz, the Alice in Wonderland, excuse me, is actually the prototype for the Wizard of Oz. I mean, if you pay attention to both stories, I mean, they're almost run very parallel, where they have this young woman going to this magical land to go through an adventure to essentially receive a Gnostic epiphany. So with Alice in Wonderland, it's a good intro because it actually is sort of the template for the Wizard of Oz. One of the things that was always interesting in Alice in Wonderland is Lewis Carroll, who was a mathematician at Christ Church. He pays homage in Alice in Wonderland to his fellow mathematician John Dee, who was Queen Elizabeth's court astrologer and magician. And that's with the symbolism of painting the roses, the white roses, red. And that's a clear reference to Dee being the proto-thinker of the Rosicrucian movement. In fact, that can actually go back to Spenser's The Fairy Queen, where the Red Cross Knight is also John Dee. So Lewis Carroll also pays tribute to Dee with the whole symbolism of painting the rose bushes. They're white and they go to red. And that's, of course, a reference to the Rose Cross, the Rosicrucians, the Red Rose of the Tudors, and Dr. John Dee. Moving forward to The Wizard of Oz, yes, lots going on in this. This is a movie that I took on originally in my first book, which I'm actually doing another edition of. There's really three layers of symbolism in The Wizard of Oz. First, you just have the basic story that this is this girl, this young woman going to this magical, strange land to have an adventure, and she winds up going home. And then we have the political allegory as well, which is Baum encoded a lot of late 18th century symbolism regarding political movements, the economy, socio-economic movements into the Wizard of Oz, and I'll delve into those. And then, of course, you have your occult, esoteric take on it, which involves Gnosticism, involves Hebrew Kabbalah. This you will also find in The Wizard of Oz. And this should come as no surprise because Baum was a member of Madame Blavatsky's Theosophy movement, and so was his wife. So this notion that Baum was somehow accidentally encoding this or was ignorant or didn't know what he was doing, and this is all coincidence, that falls flat on its face. Baum knew exactly what he was doing. And Carroll was involved with similar things as well. So again, to find this in there is not shocking or alarming, at least in my opinion. Getting back to The Wizard of Oz, I'll delve into the topics I just mentioned. And then there is another area which has to do with this, what I would describe as this Native American Aleister Crowley procession of the equinoxes changeover from the age of Pisces to Aquarius, what Crowley called the Aeon of Horus. And that is a long story, but I certainly will touch on it a little bit. This is really the subject matter of the next two books I'm working on, which is Cinema Symbolism 4, and then I'm going to do a book called Cinema Symbolism Oz, which is going to be strictly Wizard of Oz symbolism, everything from what I was mentioning with the political, the Gnosticism, Aleister Crowley, Pink Floyd, all that good stuff. So just to delve in a little bit, starting with The Wizard of Oz, of course, we have the political allegory. This one's a little more common, but it is interesting where clearly the Wizard of Oz is William McKinley. And the reason it's McKinley, who's the 25th president, is he was very big into using the gold standard and what's something else called the free silver movement to back paper money, to back greenbacks. And of course, this is why McKinley dwells in the Emerald City, signifying green money, paper money. On a side note, McKinley was also known as the Tariff King. He was huge into tariffs and placing them onto other countries. And President Trump, our current president, has also referenced McKinley and cites McKinley as one of his inspirations for using tariffs. And you will actually find in the media sometimes Trump being referred to as the Wizard of Oz. And that's a vis-a-vis reference to Trump to McKinley, who was, of course, Baum's prototype for the Wizard of Oz. And of course, being green money, Emerald City, and of course, it's the gold standard or the yellow brick road that leads to the creation of paper money. In the novel, Dorothy's slippers are silver, they're not red. The reason they were changed in the movie was the silver didn't appear right with the Technicolor. It looked strange, off color. So Victor Fleming had had enough, and he said to Adrian, get rid of the silver slippers and do something else. And of course, Adrian, who was MGM's most famous costume designer, came up with the ruby slippers. So the silver slippers were the free silver movement, which was similar to the gold standard. The scarecrow is, of course, the American farmer. The Tin Man is the American laborer. There was some massive recessions in the late 19th century that saw a lot of American laborers being laid off. One of the saviors of the American laborer was J.P. Morgan and Nelson Rockefeller, the oil companies. So naturally, to get the American labor back to work and mobile and moving, they went to work for Standard Oil. And of course, in the novel and even in the movie, the Tin Man becomes active again, kinetic, when he gets oiled up with the oil. And of course, that's J.P. Morgan and Nelson Rockefeller. Dorothy is a representation of Theodore Roosevelt, who is McKinley's vice president. She's sort of the common girl. Roosevelt held himself out as the common man. The little dog Toto is a reference to McKinley's political opponent, Williams Jennings Bryan, who was a teetotaler. That means he didn't drink. That's where the name of Toto comes from. So we have a lot of political allegories. The hurricane, the cyclone, represents foreclosure of the American farm. Again, there was heavy recessions at the end of the late 19th century that saw a lot of farmers lose their farm homes or their homesteads. So we have that whole allegory as well. So that's sort of the political, in a nutshell, the allegory. And then we get into the sort of the esoteric, the Madame Blavatsky Gnostic allegory, where it's clearly meant to be, and you can even see the parallel with Alice in Wonderland, where Alice goes down the rabbit hole, Dorothy goes up the tornado. This, of course, is the great chain of being, the Kabbalistic spheres, the Gnostic spheres of purification, where she winds up in the magical land. One of the things that's very interesting when she arrives at the magical land, you'll notice in the movie, when the house falls on the sister and the Wicked Witch arrives, she tries to get the ruby slippers. You'll notice the feet curl up, and they curl up and then they disappear under the house. And then a few moments later, Dorothy sets out on the yellow brick road, which is also a spiral. That is the Fibonacci sequence, and it's also known as the Fibonacci spiral. And the significance of that is the Fibonacci sequence or spiral signifies spiritual growth. Or improvement or maturation. And of course, this is exactly what happens. Dorothy goes on this magical adventure, and she winds up coming to know herself. This was the sort of the end game of the mystery religions, is to know thyself. And of course, for her, there's no place like home. So we have the allusion to the Fibonacci sequence there right at the beginning. If you fast forward and you see the movie Wicked, this is interesting also. When you watch Wicked, when Glinda, this is Ariana Grande, at the very beginning, descends to Munchkinland or Munchkin City, pay a close attention to Ariana Grande's pink dress. That's also the Fibonacci spiral. And that is an allusion hearkening back to the original Wizard of Oz. And that's also signifying in Wicked the spiritual journeys of both the Wicked Witch and Glinda, the Good Witch, Elphaba. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. So we have that going on. And then, of course, the Yellow Brick Road is the golden path of enlightenment, which leads, and this is a tenet of Blavatsky's Theosophy, that it leads to the demiurgic creator, the false god, which is, of course, the wizard, who is not who he seems to be. And he isn't. And of course, he's exposed as the fraud and the charlatan that he is. But in the end, Dorothy does have her epiphany. She does come to know herself, which for her, there's no place like home. And again, this is sort of the Gnostic tale of the Wizard of Oz. One of the things that's interesting, if you're familiar with Hebrew Kabbalah, this runs parallel with the spheres, the Sephiroth being these trials and tribulations that the soul must progress through to reach the Godhead. And of course, we see this in the Wizard of Oz with things like the apple trees or the flying monkeys or the witch's castle or even the poppy field. These are all trials. that Dorothy and her companions must overcome to get this spiritual enlightenment that they are so desperately seeking. The Wicked Witch, in Hebrew Kabbalah, the one of the sephirs on the in there is what is known as Gevurah, and that's the negative female archetype, and that of course is the personification of the Wicked Witch. So she comes right out of the world of Hebrew Kabbalah, and again, she is something that has to be overcome for Dorothy to receive enlightenment, Gnostic awakening, call it what you will. So, in a nutshell, that's, I mean, I'm scratching the surface a little bit, but that's some of the things going on in The Wizard of Oz. The one thing I'll just end, and I'll let you jump back in, is this movie is highly influential, and even more so than I first anticipated. When I analyze movies now, I inevitably watch them through another lens. I watch them through, of course, regularly, and then I look for, like, the occult, Gnostic, alchemical influence on them, Easter eggs, of course, but then I always keep an eye out for the Wizard of Oz allusions, because they're more pronounced than even I at first anticipated. I mean, we talk about movies like Back to the Future or the Ty West trilogy, X, Pearl, Maxine. We find all sorts of Wizard of Oz allusions in there.
Wow, that is a lot to unpack right there. You really are bringing it out now. Like, and I know you touched on the gold standard in reference, and is that, and I'm not sure if you said this, but is that in reference to the yellow brick road, is in reference to the gold standard as well? Or
Correct.
Is it also in representation to like a path to enlightenment? Because along this journey is when she, begins to find herself. You said it started out with a Fibonacci spiral, but it's also like this journey of her discovering herself and then finding out, like, there's no place like home. Maybe is home a reference to her inner self as well, like her this growth. Is that a good analogy of it?
Right. So again, there's like multi layers with this. So the yellow brick road represents two things at once. In the political sense of it, it does represent the gold standard, which leads to the creation of the paper money, which is Emerald City. That's why it's green. But then on the other level, the esoteric level, correct, the yellow brick road is what's called the golden path of enlightenment. And in the mystery religions, the idea was that you went through this trial to learn who you really were, to know something about yourself. And you can actually find if you watch the first Matrix movie, when you go see the Oracle, you'll see the words, I believe it's in Latin, know thyself, written over the entrance to her kitchen, I believe. But I think it's in another language. So this is sort of and of course, the Oracle in the Matrix is a reference to the Oracle of Delphi. But in Alice in Wonderland, it's the same thing. Alice goes on the magical journey and she comes to know herself, that the world of adults is nonsense. It's all make believe. It's all a lot of illusion and things being pretend, and they're not serious about it. For Dorothy, it's that there's no place like home. And of course, she explains it. I'll never go. If anything I'm looking for, I know is right here. And again, it varies from person to person. This is what it was for Dorothy. This is what it's for Alice. For someone else, it could be something completely different. In movies such as The Matrix, or Star Wars, even, or Dune, that's a really good example. The know thyself component is satisfied when, for example, in Dune, when Muad'Dib learns that he's the Christ savior. Same thing in The Matrix, where Neo begins to learn that he's the Christ figure, the Gnostic Christ who's come to awaken everyone from the sleeping stasis that they're in, placed there by the Demiurge creator and the Archons. So it varies from person to person. I mean, for Dorothy, it's this. For Alice, it's that. For Neo, it's this. For Luke Skywalker, it's this. For Frodo Baggins, it's to be the savior of Middle Earth. Varies from person to person based on the story, but it all overlaps. But again, when you're dealing with the Wizard of Oz, we're dealing with a lot of multi-level symbolism. And again, that's one of the reasons why it's so appealing, at least to me, is that there's more than one explanation. So the Yellow Brick Road has more than one meaning. It's the gold standard on one level, but it's also on a deeper level, this golden path of enlightenment that leads to the false messiah, which is, of course, the wizard himself.
Okay. And now I do have another question. So we're kind of talking about following the yellow brick road. I've heard that some people have stated that the Wizard of Oz had used some MK Ultra and programming, and that the following the yellow brick road symbolizing like hypnotic suggestions. Could there be like a real esoteric reason behind this?
I have heard the stuff about the CIA and MK Ultra. I mean, I cannot substantiate it. I mean,
Okay.
I cannot substantiate it to the level that I am comfortable confirming it. Um, of course, there are in the Wizard of Oz. One of the things that the filmmakers like to do is repetition. This is a way of implanting the movie into your subconscious mind. Um, and again, repetition is this is predates the CIA. Repeating things is a way to implant it into the psyche, into the subconscious. In the Wizard of Oz, of course, we have at the beginning with Professor Marvel. He mentions Osiris, who is green skinned. Then we have repetition because the witch is green skinned. And then, of course, the wizard is green skinned. So this is a repetition mnemonic. This is a mnemonic designed to implant the movie in your head. So that is happening. Now, whether the CIA is using this for some sort of mind control device, I don't know. The movie predates the foundation of the CIA by quite some time. So
You're right. Yeah.
it's clearly not a CIA product. Um, but again, it's repetition. Oh, and I just like to relate this story because when I'm just told that story, this reminded me of something, and this is a true story. And this is a great example of like synchronicity, or I mean, or just a fantastic coincidence. And this is one of the best ones. MGM, who made The Wizard of Oz, was legendary for creating the costumes that all the actors and actresses wore. I mean, even down to the extras. I mean, MGM just went all in when it came to costume creation. Their main costume designer, I forget his full name, but he just went by the name of Adrian. That's who, you mentioned MGM costumes. Adrian is what comes to mind. He's the guy who did the ruby slippers. Um, when it came to dress Frank Morgan as Professor Marvel, this is his persona at the beginning in the black and white sequence. Morgan plays four characters. He plays the wizard, he plays Professor Marvel, and he plays the two gatekeepers in the Emerald City. If you watch the black and white sequence when they're still in Kansas and Dorothy stumbles across Professor Marvel, they had, for whatever reason, MGM could not get the right look for him, for his costume. And Adrian kind of gave up on it. And he said, look, just go down to a thrift store in Los Angeles, bring me back some old jackets, and we'll just try some of those. So sure enough, they went down to some thrift shop in downtown Los Angeles, came back with some jackets, tried them on Frank Morgan. He picked out one. He said, yeah, this works really good. Let's go with this. And it did. It works. It's the one you see in the movie. Um, one day on the set when they were filming, Morgan was just sitting around with nothing better to do. This is a true story. And he turned out the label in the pocket. And the name etched on the label, believe this or not, was L. Frank Baum. Um, and sure enough, they did some research, and the jacket was actually owned by L. Frank Baum. They had to send the jacket back to his wife. She confirmed that he owned it. She said that when he passed away, it had been basically sold off or went to charity. And sure enough, when you watch The Wizard of Oz and you see that opening sequence with Professor Marvel, he is actually wearing L. Frank Baum's jacket, which is almost impossible to believe.
That I have heard that before, and that blows my mind, the synchronicity of that.
Yeah,
Like you are just drawn to this jacket, and you go to a random store and you buy a couple random jackets, and you end up picking
yeah,
the one.
yeah.
It kind of reminds me slightly of when they're choosing the Dalai Lama. They lay out all these toys in front of the children. The
Right.
children actually keeps picking the right one. It's you first have to pick this one, and then this one, and then this one, and it's kind of like the chances of that are almost impossible, and really interesting. Yeah, I have heard that before, and you had you touched on something that I also is the symbolism of color. So in the beginning of the movie, it's black and white, right, in Kansas, and then when she goes to Oz, it's color. Now, is that possibly like an alchemical transformation? Is that representing that, or what is the representation of the black and white to color?
So the way I see it is it has to do. You're on the right path. It definitely has to do with the leaving of reality to go to her mundane reality, to go to this magical land, to undergo this Gnostic adventure of call it what you will. So of course, when she gets there, now she's in this foreign land. She doesn't know where she is. and it signifies a departure from her reality. And again, this is what you find in movies such as Star Wars or The Matrix or The Wizard of Oz, or excuse me, or Lord of the Rings. I mean, it's always the farm boy who, dreams of going somewhere else. Dorothy dreams of going over the rainbow. Frodo Baggins is in Hobbiton just doing nothing. Neo is stuck in a nowhere job, and then they are called to go on this magical adventure. And again, with that, the sepia, black and white, boring reality signifies, her stasis, where she's stuck. But then, of course, she's transported, and of course, she goes up the spiral, up the, what you would call, I guess, the ladder of ascension, the great chain of being, and use Plato's terms, to the magical realm. Alice in Wonderland is very similar, only she goes down the rabbit hole, the spiral. Same sort of symbolism, same sort of thing, only one's up, one's down. And this does have to do with something that Plato described called the great chain of being. So, same sort of thing. So, absolutely, the black and white is her boring reality. The color is the awakening to the magical realm, that she is going to have this adventure where she is going to come to understand who she is.
I think that's another movie that really exemplifies that is, I believe it's called Pleasantville, where the movie itself starts in black and white, and as the character evolves and they turn into color, and there's still parts of Pleasantville that are still black and white, and those people need to evolve as a person, as a self, as their consciousness, spiritual growth, and once they do, they attain the color.
Right.
It's interesting. Yeah.
It's the same sort of thing, believe it or not. The movie Oppenheimer fools around with this. If you watch that, you'll notice it's half in black and white and then half in color. And the color perspective is from Oppenheimer's point of view, which he's trying to advance science, come up with the atom bomb. The black and white is from Strauss's point of view, which is sort of the mundane reality where he's sort of the villain and trying to control Oppenheimer. So one of the things I always say is keep an eye out when you watch a movie. Movies that shift from black and white to color, that's usually a Wizard of Oz illusion. And that usually has something to do with spiritual growth or enlightenment or resistance to the growth, which would, of course, be Strauss versus Oppenheimer. So when you see a movie and it flip-flops between black and white and color, usually that has some sort of Wizard of Oz, Ozian illusion, as it were.
Fantastic. And I know you keep referencing, the farm boy and Frodo Baggins and Alice and Dorothy and all, and just so everybody knows, what you're kind of referencing is the hero's journey, right?
Right.
We're talking about the hero's journey, which is, which follows so many of the great movies. You have this person, and then they have a call to action. They're usually met with another wiser person who guides them, and then it's like this deep dive into the darkness, and then possibly a death or defeat, and then this victory at the end, and then return back to normal. But everything is not normal anymore. Everything has changed since that point.
Well, that's right. And again, that is a very fair assessment, is that some of this is the monomyth. I totally agree with you on that. I would caveat that a little bit, saying I agree with you, but it is strange. There seems to be a more, especially recently, of a heavy, more reliance on the Wizard of Oz. I agree with you. I mean, you will clearly see elements of the monomyth in Wizard of Oz. I do not dispute that, and you'll see those components pretty much, at least one or two of them, in just about every movie that's ever made. But if you look at some movies, they are definitely more hinting at the Wizard of Oz than they are towards the monomyth. Like, for example, one of the movies we were just talking about before we went on air was Back to the Future.
Yes.
And of course, Back to the Future, the first one does have, what you would call your Wizard of Oz illusions in there, where Marty McFly gets transported to this strange reality where he encounters doppelgangers of the people that he knows from his own reality. And then, of course, at the end, winds up confused in bed, not sure if it's a dream or what he went through actually happened. One of the things that's interesting when Marty McFly gets transported back in time, the first thing he encounters is the Scarecrow. And of course, that's in a Wizard of Oz illusion. It's the first cat person that Dorothy encounters, and he actually winds up on a homestead, much like Dorothy's in the Wizard of Oz with Peabody's farm. So, Apocalypse Now. We have Martin Sheen starting off in the strange journey. He actually begins in Oz, where he goes through this adventure and meets these eccentric characters, where he ultimately has to go and defeat Colonel Kurtz, who is both the green-skinned wizard and the green-skinned witch, two people in one. So again, we can see, I mean, granted, I hear you, it is the monomyth, but we definitely could see we could definitely see an Ozian overlay with this also.
Really cool. Okay. And something else also is that the Oz is, I believe, is divided into like 4 quadrants, right?
Well, that's really in the novel.
Okay.
That you really don't see too much in the movie.
Yes.
In fact, it's never really mentioned in the movie. There's like Munchkin Land, like the land of the Winkies, and of course you're familiar with David Lynch and Mulholland Drive. The fast food restaurant is Winkies. That's the Winkies were the Royal Guardsmen, the witches' Royal Guardsmen. Those are the Winkies. That's more in the book than it is in the movie. David Lynch, Wizard of Oz allusions all over the place in his work. Very, very overt in the one with Nicolas Cage and Laura Dern, whose names I am always Wild at Heart. Very obvious in that one, but you'll definitely find Wizard of Oz allusions almost all over the place in a lot of his work. Not all of it, but a lot of it. But no, I believe that if you look at a map of Oz, it is broken into different quadrants with different names. I can't say I'm the foremost expert on that, but yes, that's true.
Okay. Okay. Cool. Interesting. And I had another question. Was now on the set of Wizard of Oz, I think there's something you haven't mentioned yet, but I know it's something that's big. Is in the back of one of the scenes, we see something quite dark. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Right. So this is a urban legend that goes back to when when I was growing up. And there's this is debatable, but there seems to be some traction with this because um, the story is that it's the scene where they meet the Tin Man and they're leaving the little house, I believe, or maybe it's when the witch throws the apples. It's one of those two, but they're walking down the road and apparently you can see. And if you go back and look at this, and you look at like old VHS tapes or when it aired in the 70s, you'll see what looks like a hanging person in the background, which was supposed to be one of the dwarfs, the little people, midgets. I don't know what the politically correct term is anymore. Hanging there, who committed suicide. If you watch different versions now, it's different. That's been edited out. There's now like a stork there instead. So there seems to be some traction to this. There was in the Culver City Hotel. That's where they put up a lot of the Wizard of Oz cast, and that's where all the Munchkins stayed. And there were, of course, these stories that the Munchkins were having these Dionysian parties there and things like that. And they actually made a movie about this called Under the Rainbow that came out in the or I think it was called Under the Rainbow. Maybe I'd have to look, which was about this, which was about these adventures. And again, this is another illusion we'll find in Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut, which is in the name of the costume shop. And again, Eyes Wide Shut, another Ozian, where it's the tale of the guy going to the strange land to encounter these dark characters, to ultimately learn that the Illuminati really does rule the world. So again, Eyes Wide Shut, very heavy Wizard of Oz influence as well. And I believe the costume shot in that was called Under the Rainbow also, which is a clear Wizard of Oz illusion. If you watch the movie that came out last year, Late Night with the Devil, if you look at the set, it's a rainbow turned upside down, Under the Rainbow, another Wizard of Oz illusion, very clever. So yeah, we'll see these illusions, but I lost track of what the actual question was at the beginning with. Oh, the hanging Munchkin.
Yes, yes.
So yeah. I mean, it depends. I think there's something to the story because if you look at different versions, there is definitely a version of it you can find on YouTube where this was like an old VHS tape that someone had recorded it from like the early 80s, and you'll clearly see the Munchkin hanging there. If you watch versions of it now or the Blu-rays, this has all been edited out, or it's a stork there. Sometimes you'll see a stork there instead. But I believe there's something to this, based on what I've seen, because why edit this out? And they'll say, oh, well, that was never there. It was never there. That's not true. It was there, because if you could watch early videotapes of it, or like when it aired in the 70s or early 80s, people who had found old VHS tapes of it, you'll clearly see that thing hanging in the background.
Okay, interesting. Very interesting. Is there, Robert, before we move on, because I know I definitely would like to go a little touch into Back to the Future, but is there anything else you want to go over in Wizard of Oz? Wizard of Oz.
So I will just touch on this, and again, this is really the subject of my next two books. There is this very peculiar death curse related to the Wizard of Oz that kills people and things related to a numeric sequence. And it comes out of the world of Aleister Crowley, of all people, because as crazy as this is going to sound, his Gematria syncs with a lot of the Wizard of Oz. And it is clear that it's a long story, and again, I'm still trying to cultivate how I'm going to wind up talking about this in podcast, because you really need a lot of background information to it. But it has to do with the change of Pisces to Aquarius, the advent of a new sun god where Jesus isn't it anymore. Jesus, of course, is Pisces. We have this new one for Aquarius, and we had this changeover that seems to have been going on. Has been going on for about the last 80 years or so. And it syncs with Crowley's Gematria, and it's uncanny. It is the most astounding thing that I've ever seen in my whole life.
And sorry, before you go too far, can you explain a little bit of Gematria? Just a little bit of Gematria.
So Gematria is the assignment of numbers to letters and to words. And Crowley gives some numbers that are quite astounding in his Gematria. The two big numbers, there's several of them, there's more than one, but the two big numbers are the number 77, the number 42, the number 333 pops up, the number 93, of course. And these are all numbers, the first two especially, 77 and 42, that relate to the Wizard of Oz. And 77 has to do with the number of this New Age sun god, and the number 42, if you read Crowley, 42 is the number of what he calls the great number of the curse. He said, this is your kill number. He said, when this number pops up, you are dead. And why this ties to the Wizard of Oz is the number 42 is the rainbow. Human beings cannot perceive a rainbow unless it's at a 42-degree angle. And of course, what's the most famous song from The Wizard of Oz? It's Over the Rainbow. The number 77, believe it or not, is this New Age sun god, and Crowley gives it a nickname. He says this New Age sun god is called Oz, O-Z. Quite astounding. And if you understand, not you personally, but when the person or the listener comes to understand what's been going on with the astrology, changeover from Pisces to Aquarius, how these numbers are being used, it's quite startling. I've never quite seen anything like it. I mean, it is without question that this curse, which I believe started with Native Americans, and this is another story, somehow morphed into a killing curse. And instead of going after L. Frank Baum, it somehow latched itself onto Crowley's numbers, because Crowley's numbers sync with the Wizard of Oz. And you will find, if you go back in time, these numbers surrounding all the main catastrophes, from the Kennedy assassination to the death of Princess Diana, who is astounding. The nexus with Princess Diana and Crowley's numbers is through the roof. I mean, 9/11 is crazy, Columbine is crazy, JFK is crazy, RFK is crazy. Princess Diana takes the cake. I mean, the numbers with her are off the chart with him. That is a study of in itself. And again, this is the subject that I'm working on for my next two books. They are coming along very well. Probably not going to get them out as soon as I want, but I'm real happy with the way they're progressing. And again, once these books come out, we'll definitely do shows on them, because it's really, you need the backstory, and then you need the backstory, which takes me about a half an hour to get into. And once the backstory is explained, then it'll all start falling into place, and you say, holy crap, now I get it. Now I see what's going on here. So again, this is what I'm working on right now, and the next two books, they're coming along very well. So,
okay. So you can't tease a little bit about these numbers without going just into a little bit more detail within them. What are the numbers? What you said with Princess Diana. Let's jump to there.
All
What
right. Well,
if you have that handy? Because I know trying to remember that on the top of your head is probably something that might be a little difficult.
right. It is a little difficult for me just to do it off the top of my head. Like for example, one of the things that this curse does is it overlaps. You will inevitably find a reference to something in like the Princess Diana death, um, that will turn up years later, like with coronavirus or the Kennedy assassination that references the death of Princess Diana. You'll find overlap with this thing where something references or anticipates a future tragedy. Um, I'm trying to think with some of the stuff on Princess Diana off the top of my head. I'd have to pull it up, but I know.
No problem.
So,
No problem.
so, for, so, so, for example, I mean, I know Dodi Al Fayed, which was the boyfriend in the Paris tunnel. He was 42 years old when they passed in the accident, and I know that the church where they had Princess Diana's funeral in London. The mileage from the church to her burial place in Althorpe is, of course, 77 miles, which is astounding. If you look at Diana, of course, she syncs with the moon. And of course, that's because Diana is the most famous lunar goddess, and that's one of the things with Crowley is his number for the moon is 81. And when did Princess Diana become a household name? In 1981, when she married Prince Charles. If you look at her relationship, her activities here on Earth with the moon, it is quite astounding. So, for example, when she died in late August of 1977, if you look at the moon, if you look at the lunar phase, the moon was waning, which means it's disappearing or dying, and it was in the sign of Leo, which rules the heart. And of course, that's what Princess Diana died of, was complications of her heart. That's another whole story is pay attention to what the moon is doing on a lot of these events. That's truly astounding as well. On 9/11 of 2001, the moon again was waning. It was a waning crescent. That means it was disappearing. And of course, on 9/11, it was in the house of Gemini, which is, of course, the twin towers disappearing. So always pay attention to the moon, what's going on those days. That's another whole story. But again, with Princess Diana, I remember the 77. I know Dodi was 42. One of the things that was really curious with them is if you look at the tunnel and you go above it, is of course the torch. And this was the torch that was wound up on the Statue of Liberty. This is the Torch of Liberty. This is the small model of it. And of course, Dodi Al Fayed was a movie producer. And the first movie he produced was Chariots of Fire. And if you look at the movie poster, it's the torch being held up. I mean, so that's a synchronicity there. And then, of course, we have it anticipating the coronavirus. If you go across the street from that torch, there is a restaurant there called the La Grande Corona, which is, of course, the coronavirus. And you will find that. You will find references to the coronavirus all over the place in a lot of these accidents. Here, let me pull up one for you. There's one that I just did on another podcast that the guy was blown away with. So give me 1 second here. Let me pull this up. Let me pull up my book. It's just so many of this.
Yeah, no problem.
It's just so overwhelming. But let me pull this
And
up.
that number 42, plays a extremely prominent role in the book series and the movie Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, because the answer to life is 42. I mean, the ultimate answer is 42, and they're like, well, what does that mean? That is the ultimate answer. So what does that mean? And you were saying that's in reference to, like, if you see 42, you're dead. So that's a perfect balance for life is death as well.
So one of the things that was unique with 9/11 and anticipating the coronavirus, and again, these numbers all come out of Crowley. 777, 77 is the New Age sun god. If you read Crowley, the number 777, the number 777 is the satanic forces of the Kabbalah marshaled. So that is all the evil forces, Lucifuge, Rofacal, these evil forces marshaled. And this is, of course, heralding this very dark age of Aquarius that we're entering into. Um, One of the things that was interesting is that 700, oh, let's see, let me go here. Oh, here we go. 777 days after 9/11, which is October 28th of 2003. So 777 days after 9/11, we're going to fast forwarding to October 28th. This is 2003. We had the Halloween solar storm, which the sun emitted coronal mass ejections. And of course, coronal, we think of the word coronavirus. It means crown. And if you're wondering, again, we go back to the Wizard of Oz, the name Judy Garland, her last name Garland, which is a stage name, is a crown. That's what a garland is. So again, we have another illusion there. So on October 28th, this is 777 days after October, on October 28th, 2003, we had the solar storms of coronal mass ejections. And then, of course, this foreshadows the illness because exactly 5,929 days later, after October 28th, 2003, this is on January 21st, 2020, the Centers of Disease Control identified the first U.S. case of novel coronavirus in Shonash County, Washington. So 5,929 is exactly 77 squared. So that's really astounding. If you go to 9/11, for example, on the morning of 9/11, exactly when battling the Twin Towers, the blazes, exactly 343, I believe it is. One moment, let me pull this up. Let me go somewhere else. So correct. On the morning of 9/11, 2001, battling the blazes in the Twin Towers, exactly 343 first responders died. 343 is 7 cubed. That's 777 again. And up until that day, up until November 10th, 2001, in Lower Manhattan, up until that day, the number of firemen and first responders that had died on the call of duty was exactly 777. So again, that is not a coincidence here. This is all Aleister Crowley's Gematria at play. This is Crowley pulling the strings from the afterlife, irrefutably. And again, this is something that is the subject matter of my next two books.
And I'm positive we touched on this the last time we talked. We didn't go into detail, but it's kind of I recall saying this, like, if you could decipher these numbers, you could predict the future almost, per se. Like it's so random trying to figure out when they're going to pop up next. But if they do, you could be like, okay, something's going to happen here. If you put them all into, maybe to an AI model that could, calculate everything and saying there's a chance, a high probability, a frequency of something happening here because this is this number, cubed, and this is, we're at this point. There's 777 people that are in this one. They're going to be attending this conference. This could be the 42nd week of the year, something along that line.
It's a good way of putting it. The problem you have with it, I've tried doing this. I've tried doing what you've done is, the problem is you don't know if you're dealing with 7 days, 77 days, 77 months, or 77 years, 42 days, 42 weeks. 93 is another huge number in this. 333 is another number that pops up. 418 is another number. 7 itself is another number. Again, you have to really be familiar with Crowley's Gematria here, but that's what makes it a little more difficult to anticipate or predict out, is because you don't know exactly what you know the numbers, but you're not sure what it's using it for. Is it 77 hours, 77 days, 77 weeks? That always comes into play. But I've tried creating models off of it, but with no success. But it is. I've tried to predict things out, but I haven't been able. I've gotten a little bit with it, but again, that's one of the ways you can identify this thing is through these numbers popping up. And believe me, when they start turning up, it's a floodgate. They start turning up all over the place. So again, this is the subject matter of my next two books. That was a little taste of it, but again, that's really just the tip of the iceberg. The rabbit hole, as it were, goes a lot deeper.
This kind of reminds me a little bit of, and I'm not sure if any of this connected, but I talked with recently with Bill and Jackie Kuselas. They're the authors of a book, Bridging the Tragedy, which is about the Mothman sightings and the collapse in Point Pleasant, the Silver Bridge collapse in Point Pleasant. And they were saying that a lot of, like, they said that there was a lot of prophecies, but they couldn't really figure out what they really meant. There's a lot of messages, but they was trying to figure out, like, when, or like you're saying, you have all these numbers and you're like, okay, but is it this or is it that? It's like trying to figure this out and to decipher this to actually get the pinpoint message or the pinpoint prophecy, the pinpoint time of something occurring. So it's interesting that you were saying that.
It's in my eyes, the reason that these numbers are happening is because, and I talk about this in the book, it's an identification of a new sun god that is on the rise and the ceasing of one on the way out. And it's a way of this solar changeover to identify itself. So it's it's doing two things at once. It's designating this new solar age, the age of Aquarius, which Crowley called the age of Horus. It's doing that, and in doing that, it's killing. And it's killing because I believe there was a curse behind this, which is another story. But it's also because if you read Crowley, he says that the new sun god is a bloodthirsty monster. So the fact that there is all this death and destruction around his number 77 doesn't surprise me. So I think that's really, from my point of view, that's the motivation from it. I think I heard someone sent me I don't know if it's the same two people, but I know about a year ago, someone sent me a link to an interview about someone talking about Mothman, and they were saying how there were some nexuses to the Wizard of Oz also. So it could be related. I mean, there could be a nexus there. I'd have to take a deeper look at it. But again, the curse turns up in different places in different times, and again, the giveaway is the numbers. If the numbers are not present, if you cannot find the sequencing of numbers, it's not it.
Okay, yeah. So those numbers are the key. We just don't know how to organize that key and in which lock it fits into is the point in advance. We don't know in advance. Looking back, we're able to then decipher and piece it together and calculate. Okay, that's where it was. So if there was a way we could crack that code, because it kind of is a code, perhaps we'll have an insight on things that will happen that are going to happen in the future. That's really interesting. Mm-hmm.
This thing is very clever, and it's very sardonic. It's by far and away the most darkest and evilest thing I've ever looked at. And one of the things that makes it so pernicious is in all these tragedies, in all of them, these numbers will not only be present, and this ties in with Crowley's Gematria, and this is what makes this thing so astounding, is there will always be buried in there, and it's hidden very, very well. In all these tragedies, there will always be this little Wizard of Oz illusion that is concealed in there somewhere, no matter what it is. Whether it's Columbine or whether it's the death of Princess Diana or JFK assassination or RFK or 9/11, buried in there will always be some sort of hidden reference to the Wizard of Oz. And that's another tell of this thing, is because if that Wizard of Oz reference isn't there, this isn't it. And again, when you see it, it really, when I research this, and I've been on other shows talking about this, when you see it, for me, and you're looking at it, it really is like staring in the face of a demon, or something very evil laughing at you. It's very dark. It's very disturbing. But again, it's the numbers, and then you will always find in there buried this little Wizard of Oz illusion. It's very cruel, very, very, very dark. It's the only way I can describe it.
Okay, well, that's really, really fascinating, Robert. Yeah, macabre. Yeah, I agree. Though it is interesting and fascinating because I think from it we can derive a lot of, from looking into the dark or looking into the abyss. You can get some answers, but like it says, is that the abyss is looking back at you as well by Nietzsche there. But I think we're getting close to winding this up, though, Robert. But is there anything else you would like to touch on with? Let's just stick with Wizard of Oz or Aleister Crowley. Is there anything else that is interesting that we'd like to touch on before we call it a day?
No, I think we covered a lot today. We could come back and certainly do another Back to the Future show. Again, that incorporates a lot of the Wizard of Oz in it. And there's the one thing I like about the Wizard of about Back to the Future. And I found this in the Ty West movies, the X Pearl Maxine trilogy is the one thing that the Wizard of Oz, I keep saying it, the one thing Back to the Future does very, very well. In fact, it's probably one of the best trilogies. Is there's references all over the place in the first one to the second one to the third one, foreshadowing things moving back and forth. You really find a lot of that in Back to the Future, and that's what makes it so interesting to watch. Is all these little like backwards, forwards little references. I mean, one that I'll just give you a couple teasers is
Please, yeah, let's do it.
one of the things that's really interesting is when in part two, when Marty goes back in time, when Doc and Marty go back in time, but they're in the Biff Tannen alternate universe. When they're in the Biff Tannen alternate universe where Biff is the casino king, when Marty goes into the Biff Tannen Museum, you'll notice a wax figure of Biff Tannen standing there. And if you take a look at it very carefully, he's holding a gold horseshoe, meaning good luck, in his left hand. And it's seen right when the little homage to Buford, or the little reference, the history of Buford Tannen, comes up on the screen. And of course, that's foreshadowing part three, where Buford kills Doc over a thrown horseshoe. That's interesting. Then you have in part two, when they're in 2015, Doc is changing to go back to 1985, and he has a Hawaiian shirt on. If you take a look at the Hawaiian shirt very closely, it's speeding trains, followed by two cowboys. And of course, this is anticipating the events of part three. If you go ahead and watch part three, when Marty and Doc hold up the train, take a look at Doc's bandana that he has over his face. That's the old Hawaiian shirt with the trains on it, but it's faded and it's of course worn out because of the ravages of time. And then the other thing that's really interesting is, and this is almost impossible to pick up, and it's hard to see because it's a deleted scene that they should never have taken out in part two. When Biff goes back in time to give himself the sports almanac, if you remember in part one, when Marty interferes with his parents' meeting, of course, he starts changing the future, and he has the photograph where his brothers and sisters, because the eldest going to the youngest, starts disappearing because he's altered the future, and they're being erased from time because they would never exist. And then, of course, at the Enchantment Under the Sea Ball, Marty starts to disappear because his time is up, and they're not going to meet, and then of course his parents aren't going to fall in love, so they're not going to have children. So Marty starts to disappear, but of course it's saved at the end. If you watch part two, when Biff Tannen comes back to 2015, he looks like he's having a heart attack. And this was a deleted scene. When the scene keeps going, he disappears. He erases himself from history. And that's because when he went back in time, he gave himself his younger version, the almanac. Of course, that Biff Tannen, the older Biff Tannen from 15, can no longer exist. If you really watch this carefully, and you really have to pay attention, when the old Biff Tannen is in 1955 and he's sitting in the car next to his younger self, when he gives his younger self the almanac, take a look at his arm. The minute that he hands him the almanac, his arm starts to disappear. And that's because he's begun the process of erasing himself from history. And it is almost impossible to see. But that is really, really a great reference, because when he gets back to 2015, of course, he vanishes entirely because he could never existed. But when he's back in time in 1955 and he gives himself his younger version, the almanac, at that point in time, he can no longer exist. Look at his arm, it starts to disappear. Very, 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 very well crafted.
Yeah, there is many like paradoxical kind of situations or kind of like things like that, where, such as in the first movie, where Marty comes back to his regular time, and the Marty of that time is leaving, right? He is taking off in the DeLorean, the time machine. But you got to imagine, though, that Marty at that time is living his perfect life, right? So how did that happen? How did that arise? Because that Marty had that great truck, he had everything, he had perfect parents, he had a great life. So how did he get to that point of getting into that DeLorean to take off, and so that the Marty from the other timeline can take over? It's interesting.
Yeah, well, that's because when he goes back in time, he alters everything.
Exactly.
He changes how.
Exactly.
I mean, you'll even see it. I mean, and this one's well known. When he goes back in time, when he goes in 1985, when he goes, and you probably know this one. This one kind of well known. When he goes to meet Doc at the very beginning at the shopping center. The shopping center is called the Twin Pines Mall.
Yes.
Right, you know this one. And of course, when he goes back in time, Doc Brown says this was all owned by old man Peabody. He had this crazy idea about breeding pine trees. Marty goes back in time, and when he escapes the farm, he kills the one pine tree. And Peabody says, "You crazy space bastard, you killed my pine tree." Of course, when he comes back, it's now the Lone Pine Mall.
Exactly.
And if you watch part 2, when they're flipping through the newspapers, there's actually an article in there when Biff is rising, when he's ascending, when he gets the money. It's very small. It's at the bottom. It says Biff Tannen buys Lone Pine Mall. So you'll actually find it in the alternative timeline as well. So at any rate, those little nuances, very good in Back to the Future. And
yes, they do it very well.
Good way to end the show.
I think so as well. Robert, one last time, tell everyone where they can find you, and thank you again for coming out.
Well, thank you, Ryan, for having me on the Codex of Curiosities. It was my pleasure to be here, of course. And again, if you're interested in me and my books, all the books can be found on all the major retailers, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million. If you want to find more information about me, go to my website. It's Robert W. Sullivan 4, the number 4.com, robertwsullivan4.com. Links to buy the books, information about me, podcasts, upcoming information, a blog that's routinely updated, although I've let it slide for the last couple of weeks. Links to buy the books, information about me. Go there, check it out. It's a very easy website to navigate, www.robertwsullivan4.com. And thank you again for having me on. It was my pleasure, and we'll do this again in the near future.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Robert. All right, everyone. That was Robert Sullivan IV with some great insight onto the Wizard of Oz. So, again, everyone, that is a wrap. And that was a little bit of a deep dive into the Wizard of Oz and all those esoteric hidden layers within it. It's always fascinating to see how stories we thought we knew so well can hold such a rich, mysterious meaning if we just look a little bit deeper. Now, remember the journey of discovery never ends, and sometimes the answers we seek are right in front of us. So thanks for joining me today. I'm Rai, the Codega, and this has been another episode of Codega's Codex of Curiosities. So keep your curiosity wandering, keep the light lit, and always find your way home.
Beneath the stars where shadows grow, the Nephilim's echoes whisper low. Bigfoot roams through the forest deep, and Dogman prowls where the brave won't sleep. Across lost history we wonder why, seeking the truth that time tried to hide. Keep your curiosities wandering and the light lit. Through the darkness, don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come, and always find your way back home. UFOs streak through the velvet skies. Aliens watch with unblinking eyes. The paranormal hums where silence breaks. In the void of secrets, a lantern wakes. Through hidden realms and stories untold, the Codex flame is the light to hold. Keep your curiosities wandering and the light lit. Through the darkness, don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come, and always find your way back home. unblinking eyes. The paranormal hums where silence breaks. In the void of secrets, a lantern wakes. Through hidden realms and stories untold, the Codex flame is a light to hold. Keep your curiosities wandering and the light lit. Through the darkness, don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come and always find your way back home. Legends rise from the Earth's deep core, a lost legacy we can't ignore. With every step, the veil grows thin, revealing worlds where the strange begins. Keep your curiosities wandering and the light lit. Through the darkness, don't ever quit. In the Codex, the mysteries come and always find your way back home. Giants, cryptids that call, aliens, histories, we'll uncover it all. With the Codega, we'll never be alone. Together we'll always find our way home. Oh, oh, oh. Oh, oh, oh.